We have been sold the image of Napoleon as the most powerful man in history. But the truth is that although he conquered half the world, it seems there was one thing he could never conquer: the love of his life, Joséphine. And if we dig a little deeper, a pattern emerges. As a child, he was rejected and humiliated, which might lead us to think that perhaps the most ambitious man in the world wasn't driven by greatness, but by a desperate need to feel worthy. Behind all his conquests, there may have been a rejected child, a neglected husband, a broken man. And today, we're going to tell that story. Not the one about the military genius, nor the tyrant we've been sold, but the story of the wounded man who tried to save himself through power, but with a single mistake, lost it all. Marie Antoinette walks toward the guillotine. The people scream at her and throw food, but she keeps her head high, a head that, in seconds, is severed. They lift her head, and the crowd applauds, celebrates. They believe that with Marie Antoinette dead, kings will disappear, and so will all their problems. But no, the worst is only just beginning. Because yes, the monarchy falls, but peace does not take its place. Something far darker does. The Reign of Terror, led by Maximilien Robespierre. Robespierre is convinced that to protect the new France they're trying to build, everyone who is part of the nobility must be eliminated. But this chaos becomes the perfect opportunity for an ambitious young man looking to rise, Napoleon Bonaparte. The kings of the rest of Europe learn what's happening in France, and they panic. They fear their own people might turn on them too. So they decide to intervene. The British arrive in Toulon and take control of the port. The revolutionaries prepare to defend themselves, as always, with a direct face-to-face battle. But Napoleon, although still a low-ranking officer, insists there's a more effective way: attack the ships. Because if the British lose their ships, they lose their food, their bullets, and their reinforcements. And without that, there's no way they can hold the city. And so they do. From the hills, they set up the cannons and bombard the port. The British have no choice but to retreat, and Toulon returns to revolutionary hands. Thanks to this victory, Napoleon is promoted to brigadier general, and his name begins to circulate throughout Paris. At this point, it's worth pausing, because to understand Napoleon, first we must understand where he comes from. Napoleon was not born in France as such, but on the island of Corsica, an island that, precisely that same year, ceased to be part of Genoa and passed into French hands. The problem was that the Corsicans were not thrilled with the change. Suddenly, they had to speak a different language, follow new laws, and obey a king they didn't consider their own. So many experienced it as an invasion. Napoleon grew up in that environment, and naturally, he developed a certain resentment toward the French, especially toward their rulers. Over time, his parents realized that if they wanted him to have better opportunities, he needed to leave the island. So they sent him to study at a military school in France. But from the moment he arrived, his classmates noticed his Corsican accent and the fact that he had no money, and they began to mock him. Feeling lonely and vulnerable, Napoleon took refuge in the woods. He would spend hours reading and studying. But not just anything. What captivated him most were the stories of great conquerors: Alexander the Great, Hannibal, and Julius Caesar. Here there's something quite curious. A child who feels invaded ends up admiring those who invade. A child who feels vulnerable and powerless becomes obsessed with stories of the most powerful men of all time. It seems that admiration was more than just a taste. It seems it was his way of compensating, of escaping from feeling so small, and imagining himself as the opposite: strong, brave, and in control. Napoleon begins to excel at school, especially in military strategy, and by age 16, he's already been appointed second lieutenant in the army. Everything points to a successful career. But he ran into something frustrating. At the time, it didn't matter if you were talented, brilliant, or hardworking. The only thing that could really get you promoted was your surname, your social class. So no matter how hard Napoleon tried, his career would not advance. Until suddenly, the French Revolution broke out. As it turns out, Napoleon wasn't the only one tired of the system. The entire French population felt the same, fed up with privilege, injustice, and the elites. And overnight, being part of the nobility stopped being an advantage and became a problem. Napoleon couldn't have planned it better. It was exactly what he needed. And at the siege of Toulon, he finally had the chance to shine, and he seized it. With that, his rise to power began.
Just a quick pause to say that if you're enjoying this video and haven't subscribed yet, please consider subscribing. It would mean a lot and really helps me keep making more videos and content like this. Alright, let's get back to the story.
Napoleon returned to Paris as a hero, but upon his arrival, he realized everything had changed. Robespierre was no longer the admired leader he once was. The people, weary of so much violence, decided to send him to the guillotine. With his death, the Reign of Terror came to an end, and thousands of people who had been imprisoned based on suspicion were set free. Among them, a woman, Joséphine. One night, at a ball, Napoleon sees her. She flirts with everyone, and Napoleon can't take his eyes off her. She approaches him, asks about his uniform, and realizes she's standing before a man with power. The next day, a boy knocks on Napoleon's door. He asks for help retrieving his father's sword. His father was a nobleman, and when he was arrested and executed, the sword was taken from him. Napoleon shows no interest, until the boy says, "My mother says you're the only one with the power to get it back." With his ego thoroughly flattered, Napoleon decides to help. He retrieves the sword, and he delivers it personally to the boy's home. There, he is greeted by the boy's mother, Joséphine. Napoleon invites her out and starts to fall in love, but she doesn't. She doesn't find him attractive. However, she's an older woman. She no longer has the beauty she once had. She was a noble, but now she has nothing, so she decides to play along. Still, she is honest with him. She tells him all the nobles died. She didn't, and that was no coincidence. She used the only thing she had left to survive, her body. She asks him directly, "Do you care where I've been?" He replies that he doesn't, and with that, Joséphine does what she does best, seduce a man with power. Days later, Paul Barras, one of the 5 men heading the Directory, the new government of France, tells Napoleon that the royalists, those who want to restore the monarchy, are planning an attack. He asks for his help to stop them. Napoleon agrees, but with one condition. Either they give him full control, or he won't move a single soldier. Paul agrees. And on the day of the attack, Napoleon triumphs once again, and his popularity only continues to grow. Napoleon and Joséphine get married. He is madly in love with her, and she, not so much. At the wedding celebration, he notices something that bothers him. She is far too close to another man. She smiles at him, takes his arm. Napoleon says nothing, but he doesn't forget. Although many portray it as a great love story, the relationship between Napoleon and Joséphine seems, in reality, to have been quite sad. Let's just say Napoleon was not the most charismatic or entertaining man, and Joséphine, for her part, was not born in France as such, but in Martinique, a Caribbean island that was a French colony. That's why many, including her own husband, treated her as inferior and mocked her Creole accent. During the Reign of Terror, her husband was executed for being a nobleman, and she was left alone, responsible for 2 children, with no titles and no money. And in that era, a woman had very few ways to get ahead. Although the film suggests that, while in prison, Joséphine slept with the guards, there is no solid record that this actually happened. What we do know is that, once released, she began to maneuver. She entered the most important political and social circles and used her charm to get close to powerful men. One of them was Paul Barras, a member of the Directory and a friend of Napoleon. It was no secret. Joséphine had a reputation for having been with several men. In that context, Napoleon met her. And he, who had little charm or experience with women, saw her, so flirtatious and confident, he was instantly smitten. Joséphine, on the other hand, didn't feel the same. But she was a practical woman. She had neither fortune nor status, and Napoleon was a rising military officer. So, seeing his potential, she agreed to marry him. Napoleon was deeply in love with her. He constantly wrote her passionate letters. In one of them, he says, "My only and beloved Joséphine, outside of you there is no joy. Far from you, the world is a desert where I am alone and cannot open my heart. You have taken more than my soul. You are the only thought in my life. To live for Joséphine, that is the story of my life." But it seems that love was never truly reciprocated. Few letters from Joséphine to Napoleon have been preserved, and historians believe there are 2 reasons. First, because apparently she hardly ever wrote to him, and second, because the few she did send seemed cold, emotionless, and Napoleon probably didn't want to keep them. The lack of interest was clear to him, as Napoleon himself would reproach her in his letters. In one, he wrote, "There are many days when you do not write to me. You don't love your husband. You know how happy your letters make me, and still you do not even write me 6 lines." But what hurt Napoleon most was discovering that there was someone to whom Joséphine did write with passion, her lover. Napoleon begins to gain tremendous popularity in France. He becomes a figure increasingly admired by the people, and that makes the members of the Directory nervous. It's useful to have him as an ally, but they also know that if he continues rising, he could become a threat. So they decide to send him to Egypt under the pretext of blocking Britain's trade route, but in reality also to keep him far from Paris. As soon as he arrives, Napoleon imposes his power. He orders cannons to be fired toward the pyramids. If I'm being honest, I didn't love this scene. Not only because it's completely false, but because it shows exactly the opposite of what really happened and of who Napoleon was. He never fired at the pyramids. On the contrary, when he went to Egypt, he brought over 150 experts, archaeologists, architects, doctors, engineers, and linguists to study and understand the country's culture. He even founded a special academy for that, the Institut d'Egypte. He also met with Muslim leaders, dined with them, and asked about their traditions. When he found out they were unsure about celebrating the Mawlid, the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad, he personally encouraged them. He offered them a place to celebrate, and even contributed money from his own pocket. The city celebrated for 3 days. And there was Napoleon, seated as a guest of honor beside the sheikh, surrounded by scholars in robes and turbans, respectfully listening to verses from the Quran, nothing at all like what the film shows. Beyond simply being a military leader, Napoleon was also a highly cultured man. He was passionate about history, philosophy, and knowledge, and that, at least to me, makes him far more interesting than the typical cliché of the savage conqueror. The director of this film is Ridley Scott, and he tends to do these sorts of things in other movies based on real events, like Gladiator or House of Gucci. And of course, it's fair to not be 100% faithful to the story, but there's a difference between taking creative liberties and completely changing who a person was. But what do you think? Should a film based on real events be careful about what it shows, or does it not matter as long as it's entertaining? Napoleon continues writing Joséphine long, intense, love-filled letters, but she doesn't reply. She's busy with her lover. When Napoleon learns of her infidelity, something breaks inside him. He decides to return to France immediately. His allies warn him. It could be seen as desertion, but he doesn't care. He arrives home and humiliates her, forces her to apologize, to say that he is the most important thing in her life, in the world. And Joséphine, cornered, obeys. But hours later, she pulls herself together. She looks him in the eyes, and with her most seductive voice, says, "You want to be great? You are nothing without me. Say it. You're just a brute. Without me, you are nothing." Napoleon, with tears in his eyes, repeats her words. Days later, the Directory confronts him. They accuse him of desertion, but Napoleon doesn't back down. He tells them that he returned to find France in ruins, with no money, and on the brink of invasion. "I did not abandon my country," he tells them. "You did." His boldness pays off. People admire him more than ever, and many begin to see him as the new Caesar. Emmanuel Sieyès, one of the members of the Directory, sees an opportunity. He proposes a coup d'etat to Napoleon and suggests sharing power. Napoleon agrees, although deep down, he doesn't intend to share anything. He calls for a supposed government meeting on the outskirts of Paris, but in reality, it's a trap. When everyone is gathered, he enters with his troops. He threatens them and, at gunpoint, forces them to approve a reform that names him, Sieyès, and a third person as consuls. But of course, it includes a clause. Of the 3 consuls, only one has the final word, the first consul. And naturally, that title goes to him. Napoleon and Joséphine move into a castle. They live surrounded by luxury and excess, but beneath it all, there is fear. The kings of Europe do not recognize his authority. Napoleon is nothing more than an ambitious military man who could inspire their own people to rebel. They begin preparing their armies to attack him. His advisors propose a political solution: crown himself king. Napoleon laughs. After everything France fought for to abolish the monarchy, the people would hate him. Still, he doesn't have many options. He agrees to be crowned, but not as king. To mark a distinction, he chooses a different title, emperor. He organizes a grand ceremony at the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and, to lend it legitimacy, he invites the Pope to crown him. But just as the Pope is about to place the crown on his head, Napoleon takes it from his hands and places it on his own head. In doing so, he sends a clear message: no one stands above him. Even though he is now emperor, Napoleon cannot rest easy. He is missing something very important to secure his power: an heir. He's been married to Joséphine for years, but she has not been able to get pregnant. Perhaps she never will. Still, Napoleon pressures her. He needs a son, and soon. But while he's trying to secure his future, Tsar Alexander of Russia and Emperor Francis of Austria are not planning to make it easy for him. They're determined to defeat him and strip him of power once and for all. One day, they receive the news they've been waiting for. Napoleon's army has been located, and they can't believe their luck. It's small, poorly positioned, and poorly armed. The opportunity is perfect. They launch the attack and defeat him with ease. They think they've already won. They lower their guard and begin to celebrate. But what they don't know is that they've just fallen into Napoleon's trap. Just as they're disorganized, celebrating, Napoleon strikes back. Thousands of French soldiers, whom he'd kept hidden, emerge from their positions and surround them. The enemies panic. Many try to flee by crossing a frozen lake, and in that moment, Napoleon gives the final order: fire at the ice. The cannons shatter the surface. The ice breaks, and dozens of soldiers plunge into the freezing water. Napoleon wins again. Napoleon is considered one of the greatest military strategists in all of history, and there are 2 main reasons for that. The first is that he knew how to use the element of surprise very effectively. At the time, battles were fairly predictable. Both armies would form up facing each other in an open field and simply advance, fire, and hold their ground. Victory went to the side that could endure the longest without surrendering. But Napoleon, who had spent hours since his youth studying the great conquerors, began to develop his own style. He realized he didn't have to attack head-on like everyone else. He could deceive the enemy, make them believe the attack was coming from one side, while the real strike came from another. In doing so, he caught them off guard, disorganized them, and could win using less force. The second reason was that he completely changed the way armies moved. Before, armies functioned as a single massive group. All the soldiers moved together, waited for the same orders, and couldn't do much on their own. If they separated, they became disorganized. But Napoleon decided to divide his army into smaller groups, like several mini-armies, and he gave each one everything it needed to function independently: infantry, cavalry, and artillery. Thanks to that, each group could make quick decisions, move swiftly, and strike from wherever necessary, without having to wait all the time for his orders. Napoleon returns to the palace, surrounded by riches and applause. But something continues to trouble him. He still doesn't have an heir. He needs to know whether the problem lies with Joséphine or with himself. To find out, he spends the night with a young woman. Weeks later, he's told that she's pregnant. The news devastates him, because despite everything, he still loves Joséphine. In a desperate attempt, he asks his minister to pretend that the child is Joséphine's, but the minister refuses. He will not lie to the country. Napoleon has no choice left. He divorces the love of his life. Seeking to strengthen his power, he tries to ally with Tsar Alexander of Russia. They share a common enemy, England. If they stop trading with it, they could seriously weaken it. To seal the deal, Napoleon asks for the Tsar's sister's hand in marriage. But Alexander refuses, saying she's too young, although in reality, he does not want to tie his family's fate to Napoleon's. So Napoleon turns to Austria, and there he finds another option: Mary Louise, daughter of Emperor Francis. He marries her and finally has what he long desired, a son. Even so, Joséphine doesn't leave his mind. He decides to visit her and bring the child with him. She greets him with a sad smile and whispers, "One day you will understand what I sacrificed for you." Soon after, peace with Russia breaks. The Tsar resumes trade with England, violating the agreement, and Napoleon has no intention of standing idly by. He calls upon Austria, Italy, Germany, and Poland, and assembles a massive army. Nearly 600,000 soldiers march toward Russia, and with that, the beginning of the end begins. The Russians don't make it easy. They fight with everything they have, and the battle is brutal. Thousands of soldiers die. Even so, Napoleon insists they have won, and continues advancing toward Moscow, confident he will conquer it. But when he finally arrives, he finds an empty city, not a single soul. And as a final blow, the Russians themselves set Moscow on fire. They would rather see it burn than hand it over to Napoleon. Frustrated, Napoleon wants to keep going. He says they will march on to St. Petersburg so it can burn too. But his generals stop him. Winter is coming, and they're not prepared. The horses begin to freeze. The men too. Still, Napoleon insists. They advance a bit further, but it's useless. The cold is unbearable. Hunger weakens them, and Russian attacks don't stop. They have no choice but to accept defeat. On their return, the European leaders couldn't believe it. Of the 600,000 soldiers Napoleon led into Russia, only 40,000 return alive. He's lost over 90% of his army. His enemies seize the moment and attack. And he, without an army, without allies, and with no way out, falls. The French Senate forces him to abdicate, and as punishment, they exile him to the island of Elba. In France, Joséphine receives a visit from Tsar Alexander, and he flirts with her. The news spreads and reaches Elba. Napoleon finds out and is enraged. He refuses to sit by and watch everything be taken from him. He escapes the island to reclaim what he believes still belongs to him, Joséphine and France. Meanwhile, Joséphine's health begins to decline. With the little strength she has left, she writes him a letter. She asks him to come back, and Napoleon is already on the move. He arrives in France, and as soon as he sets foot on land, he kneels and kisses the ground. At last, he is home. He gathers a small army and begins marching toward Paris. The new king, afraid, sends his soldiers to stop him. But when they confront him, Napoleon steps forward, looks them in the eye, and says, "I missed you. I missed my homeland. I missed fighting by your side. I want to come home. Will you help me?" Immediately, the soldiers lower their weapons and shout, "Long live the Emperor!" Napoleon has returned, and France is once more. However, the joy does not last. When he finally arrives to see Joséphine, it's already too late. She has died, and for the first time, the invincible emperor breaks. But there's no time for mourning. The leaders of Europe learn of his return and decide to finish him once and for all. Though he's at a disadvantage, Napoleon does not give up. He studies the battlefield, crafts his strategy, and launches his men. But this time, something has changed. His enemies have learned from him, and now use his own tactics against him. They divide into small armies and move swiftly. Still, Napoleon does not surrender. He mounts his horse and joins his soldiers. And with him at the front, the French regain hope. They begin by winning. They defeat the British, but suddenly, a second army appears. The Prussians have arrived from another flank. Napoleon has no way out. He must surrender. This time, the leaders of Europe refuse to take chances. They exile him again, but not to Elba, instead to an even more distant, smaller island in the middle of the ocean, St. Helena. There he spends his final years, alone. sick, and stripped of glory. 6 years later, he dies. His final words were, "France, army, Joséphine." Napoleon was one of the most powerful men in history. He turned France into an empire and redrew the map of Europe. But according to historian Andrew Roberts, he never found peace within himself. Not even at the height of his power did he feel loved or enough. If this version is true, one could say that everything he did, all those conquests and battles, may have been attempts to fill something he felt was missing inside. I'm curious because many times we believe that once we achieve a certain goal, a certain success or recognition, that internal void will disappear. But what we see in Napoleon's story is that sometimes that emptiness cannot be filled, not even with all the victories in the world. Perhaps it's true that the void never truly goes away and that no conquest can fill it. Maybe our mistake is believing that one day something will, because in that expectation lies an inevitable disappointment. Perhaps the real task is learning to walk with the void, to understand that no goal, achievement, or destination will fulfill us completely, and that instead, it's about embracing the entire journey and working to make things better. Perhaps there, in that constant search, lies our true greatness.
Thanks for staying until the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe and share it with a friend who you think might enjoy it. And I'll see you in the next one.